Well, for more on shifting economic powers and how uncertainty is shaking up markets, let's bring in Frank Samolis. Frank is a co-chair of international trade practice at Squire Patton Boggs. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So as we're seeing these mountain tariffs from the US, and now these retaliatory tariffs starting to come in as well, how far are we from actually seeing some sort of resolution at this point?
Well, it's very hard to tell because the whole process was started when President Trump relied on a rarely used statute in the U.S. to impose the tariffs on steel and aluminum. And then he compounded the problem by removing the exemption given to Europe and Canada and Mexico. So it's a question of, in a sense, who blinks first. That's with respect to the steel and aluminum. And then you have the problem with China. And remember, China will know a lot more on Friday as to whether or not President Trump actually goes ahead with the retaliation, which would then, in theory, trigger counter-retaliation by the Chinese.
And this is really causing people to look at the overall global trade relationships. We see that Russia has now become the 7th WTO country to file a complaint against the U.S. tariffs.
Correct.
Now, President Putin interestingly said that this is the result of several years of the EU's excessive deference to the U.S. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I guess it's a matter of interpretation, but I think the overall problem is that the WTO is supposed to resolve issues on a multilateral basis through negotiations. The problem is that back in 2000, the latest round, it was called the Doha round, collapsed. And when there were no multilateral negotiations, countries had no choice but to engage in bilateral and regional talks. And that's why we have all these different trade agreements, the TPP and the NAFTA and all those other things, because the WTO isn't creating a multilateral forum.
Now, we've seen that the U.S. is essentially acting unilaterally and circumventing the WTO, and now they've got this new U.S. Fair and Reciprocal Trade Act reportedly in the works. What does this do to either help or hurt the White House's position?
Well, I think it hurts the position because it hurts our international credibility. If we are in a position now where we are going to withdraw from the WTO, we're sending a strong signal to our trading partners that we are going to continue to act unilaterally without any regard for international rules. And if that's the case, then the U.S. can continue to impose these tariffs. They can do it unilaterally, but they're doing it at the great risk of other countries retaliating. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing Canada, Mexico, several countries retaliating, and it's gotten to the point where it's hard to keep track of all the retaliatory tariffs. Our firm actually had to put together one resource book so that people could see if their products are subject to counter-retaliation from 8 different countries.
And it's interesting because we saw that the U.S.'s largest business lobbying group, the Chamber of Commerce, is now denouncing the president's handling of global trade issues and the mounting retaliations from trade partners. How much leverage do you think their voice will have at this point?
It's I don't think we've ever seen this situation before, because you have a Republican president who is incurring the strong opposition of the business community, particularly the Chamber of Commerce, and free trade Republicans in the Congress who want to restrict his authority under these national security provisions. Senator Corker moved to pass a bill like that, and he was stopped by a liberal Democratic senator who essentially defended the president. So for the first time, we're seeing a Republican willing to take on big business to play to his base, in theory, and he's getting as much support from the Democrats than his own party.
Certainly strange times indeed.
Yes.
Now, let's also look at Canada. We see that they're moving ahead with their retaliatory tariffs. And then you also have the White House saying that Canada is taking advantage of U.S. farmers with what they called dairy protectionism.
Right.
Do you think that's a fair assessment?
There is some truth to that, yes. Canada is not a totally pure trading country. They do have protective programs in place for their dairy industry. So if you look at any country around the world, there are programs and initiatives that protect the domestic producer. Just like in the U.S., Canada does the same for dairy. The problem is you can't simply act unilaterally. You have to go through some sort of mechanism to resolve it. Otherwise, you start risking a trade war.
Now, there's certainly layers to this, because on top of the tariffs, we know that Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. are also trying to renegotiate a NAFTA deal, just as we have a new president in Mexico.
Yes.
What's your take, just very quickly, on what all this is going to do? How much of these tariffs is going to weigh on these NAFTA negotiations?
Well, I think we're seeing that President Trump used a lot of these tariffs to try and increase leverage for the negotiation of a NAFTA agreement. it really didn't work. And we're no closer to a NAFTA agreement now than we were 2 years ago. So the question is, Mr. Obrador in office is probably not going to be more amenable with Mr. Trump. And therefore, I do not see a renegotiated NAFTA anytime, certainly before our midterm elections, and I think well into next year.
All right. Thank you so much for your insights. Frank Samolis there of Squire Patton Boggs.